much, Michael, for being with us today in the frameworks of the City as a classroom.
You're welcome.
My first question is, in the chapter you have sent me, City Sense, you refer to the research conducted by Stanley Milgram half a century ago about the fact that people imagine their cities differently than other people do. So what do you think is the reason why we have such a distinct imagination of cities?
Yeah, so Stanley Milgram, who is quite a famous social psychologist, he was interested in how people visualize their cities and what they feel about their cities. And yeah, so Stanley Milgram, he conducted this experiment in Paris to find out how well Parisians knew their city. And he asked people from all over the city to draw a simple map of how everything connected up. And he found that people were generally quite good at that, and that they had a good idea of where the different neighborhoods fitted in and a good idea of what the whole environment looked like. The main exception was the location and shape of the River Seine, which people imagine generally to be roughly a straight line or something that didn't curve too much. So people tended to simplify the main feature of Paris, and that's a very common mistake that people make in cities with a river. Basically, people use any useful features of their city to help them understand it, visualize it, and orientate themselves in it. So, I mean, so if Stanley Milgram had conducted his experiment in Odessa or London or New York, yeah, he may have found that people gave very different results, because people's understanding of their city depends a lot on how the city is laid out and the kind of landmarks that are there, and the nature of the street pattern and things like that.
Another experiment was conducted in London that you mentioned in the chapter, and it is related to the way our navigation skills in cities are influenced by GPS and technology that we have at our disposal. So my question is, do you think we would be much more better in navigating in cities or anywhere in the world if we did not have GPS systems?
Oh, well, that's a good question. And that experiment in London, it's difficult to... So the first thing to say is that the results were quite different to Stanley Milgram's experiment in Paris, because London's a very different kind of city. It's much bigger, and people in London seem to find it very difficult to draw a map of the city, and they seem to have not such a good understanding of how the different neighborhoods link up. So they might have a good idea of their own neighborhood and the streets and features of that, but they're not so clear about how that neighborhood might link to the neighboring one and to the rest of the city. So people were not very good at orientating themselves in London, according to this experiment. And it could have been simply because London is a very different city to Paris. It's much bigger. It's not built on a sort of universal grid. In fact, it's a series of districts and villages originally that are all linked up. It wasn't designed as a city. So that could be the reason. But of course, you mentioned GPS, and in Stanley Milgram's day, no one had GPS, and today they do. The thing about GPS is that it enables you to get from A to B across the city without understanding the city, without knowing how everything links up. You just have to follow your instructions if you navigate that way with the GPS. So yeah, it's absolutely certain that using a GPS, you basically turn off the navigation part of your brain, mm-hmm. Part of the brain called the hippocampus, where we create our sort of mental maps of the places we visit. And when it's been shown in experiments that when you use GPS to get around, that part of the brain just isn't active. So if you always use that technology, you're pretty much putting your navigation skills on the shelf. Having said that, there are ways to use GPS that, more wisely. So you can still use GPS, and it's a very useful tool, obviously, especially in a place like London, which is difficult to get around. But it's worth just trying to maintain an awareness of where you're going and keep that inner navigator in your brain ticking over, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I have read a small passage that you wrote. For instance, ants are just so good. I mean, they will never lose their home. I mean, the small ants, but people, they do get lost. I mean,
well, ants have a particular skill in being able to remember the sort of pattern of their steps, it seems. So they can go across the floor of a desert without many landmarks and go in a sort of a curved path to their food source and then come back in a straight line. That's something humans are very bad at. But ants have a few other useful talents that they bring into the picture, so they can interpret the light from the sun, the polarized light from the sun. So that helps them give an extra sort of sense of their direction. But humans are not ants, that's for sure.
All right, thank you. In the book that you wrote, I mean, it came out recently, Wayfinding, the Art and Science of How We Find and Lose Our Way. So based on your research, do you think there is a relation between between the capacity of people finding their way in the city or in different setting, and that is there a relation to the fact that those people that are good in that can find their way in life as well? These are totally two different skills, but maybe your research showed something in this direction.
So you mean someone who might be good at navigating through a city might also have the mental skills to...
Yes, mental skills, or getting back to track in their life, because sometimes we have hard times, Do you think there is a certain correlation between these things?
There does seem to be. I mean, there's certainly similarities in the navigation system in the brain and mental health, because people who suffer from depression or who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, that often affects the hippocampus, the part of the brain where our navigation calculator is, if you like. So, and people who are suffering mental illness are often not good at navigating. It's well known that if you're stressed or anxious, then that has a negative effect on your navigation skills. Being stressed, it seems to have an impact on our ability to work out where we are and to remember places. So there's definitely a link. It's also true that we use similar language when we describe if we're lost in our daily life, we talk about losing the path and losing our way, and that's the language of wayfinding, the language of navigation. So there seems to be a strong sort of symbolism connecting the two, but it may be more than that. It may be that it's the same brain circuits that are involved in all that. But certainly I've heard it recommended by neuroscientists that people who are suffering anxiety or depression, trying to navigate, find your way through an environment could be helpful, because it forces you to look beyond yourself. You have to link up features of the environment. You have to try and create a picture of the world. And so that's a way of trying to shift the sort of negative pattern that you often get into in mental illness. But I can't say that that's sort of a proven remedy, but it's an idea that's been looked at.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Would you mind please sharing in a couple of words, why did you decide to write this kind of a book? I mean, it seems that it is very well researched. I mean, it's based on a long-term research when it comes to navigation.
Usually I write about psychology and behavioral science, and in science, this area, spatial neuroscience, they call it, is a fascinating one right now, and there are lots of new discoveries looking. Spatial neuroscientists look at that area of the brain that I was talking about, the hippocampus and the surrounding regions, to try and work out how we build up our maps and why humans are so good at remembering places. And there's been a lot of fascinating work in that. So I thought it was just a good time to try and interpret some of that quite difficult neuroscience and make it more public. And I'm not a neuroscientist, so it was a great opportunity to talk to people working in that field and help me understand and explain to me what was going on. And then the other reason is a very personal reason, is just in my family, I have quite a few members of my family are pretty good at navigating, and you know, I've got a cousin who will make a journey once and always remember how she found her way. And I have other relations who are absolutely terrible at navigating and get lost, you know, all the time, whether they're walking or in a car. And so it was interesting why in one family you can have such a range of skills in this area. So that was another reason.
Interesting. And did you come to a conclusion? So why some people mess up with finding their way and others do not?
Well, I think it looks like there are lots of different reasons why some people are better than others. And partly it's to do, there's a pattern with if you grew up in the countryside, in a rural area, you tend to be a little bit better on average at navigating and finding your way than those who grew up in the cities. Because in a rural area, the environment is more complex. You have to think more about where you're going and how the roads link up and how one landmark is related to another. So it gets you exercising that part of your brain from an early age. In a city, you can do things like get on a bus where you don't have to worry about knowing exactly how one street leads to another. All the streets are parallel, so it's easier to work out where they lead. Other things are how your experience as a child and to what extent you were allowed to explore and roam by yourself. And so you build up that talent when you're young, if you're allowed off the leash, if you like. People who have a more free roaming childhood tend to be better as adults, partly because they're more confident about finding, they know that they're not going to get lost all the time, or they know that if they get lost that they'll find their way out. So, and there are other things like personality, and many different factors seem to play into why some people are better than others.
Mm-hmm. So when you were doing this research and understanding why some people are better than others, did you also take a look at their skills with dealing with maps? Because, you know, like some people are just so good in understanding a map and it makes sense to them, but some people, and usually women, are really bad with maps. Yes,
that's true. And that if you know how to use a map, then you probably have other spatial skills. You might be good at thinking about shapes and how things fit together, and you have a sort of good spatial sense. Those skills often go together, and that means it doesn't always translate to the bigger environment, but often people who are good at looking at maps tend to be good at finding their way. But it's often said that women are bad at maps, but I don't think that has to do with any innate biology. I don't think women are born worse at reading a map. It's simply that they often don't get given the opportunity to look at a map and to play with a map when they're growing up as girls. And so there's this bias, and you find it in most countries, a presumption that boys are going to be better at that kind of thing. So inevitably boys get those opportunities, and girls don't. And so they grow up and being less confident with a map and less confident at navigating. So I think that bias has a very strong effect on women's confidence in finding their way and their ability, rather than any kind of biology.
My next question would be, maybe you try to classify cities around the world in some way according to their navigability. I know there is no word as such, but you do understand what I mean, right? I mean, what types of cities are better to navigate in, which are not?
It's general. People tend to find it easier in cities where there's a strong grid pattern of the streets. So if all the streets are parallel to, they all go north-south and east-west, and that makes it easy because you can then, if you're going across the city, you can just follow a street and count the blocks. You don't have to think too much. So that's one thing. American cities are often like that. If you have a city that, I don't know Odessa where you are, but cities in Europe tend to be, they have more curves in the streets and they're not as regular, and that can be that can make them a little harder to understand. The drawback of being in a very grid-like city, like New York, for example, is that things tend to look quite similar, especially if there aren't any distinguishing tall buildings. Then it can be very confusing, even though you're looking at somewhere where it's a very straight and ordered grid. One block can look the same as another, so it's quite useful to have some distinguishing features. Ideally, I suppose the cities that are easiest to navigate are those that are easiest to visualize. The professional term for that is legibility. If a city is legible, that means it's easy to understand, easy to imagine, easy to visualize, easy to draw. And to make a city legible, it just needs to be not confusing. Streets need to connect to each other. There need to be distinguishing landmarks, buildings that don't look the same on each side, a mixture of large trees. So I think there's no simple solution, but we all know what it's like to be confused in a city. And
yeah. So you have written an amazing article in BBC Future about the way architecture influences people, but it is all about modern architecture. Have you ever thought to study the way like old ancient architecture influences us? I mean, especially in Europe, because in US and in other parts of the world, we don't have that much of old architecture which has survived.
I think that would be a great subject. I haven't researched it. I think it would be a great subject. I mean, a question of whether older architecture has more of those distinguishing features that
symbols.
Yeah, symbols that people that stick in your mind. I mean, that's really what you want. Our ancient ancestors used to navigate by remembering places and the look of places, and also giving those places names. If you can name a place, particularly if you can apply a name that somehow uses a description of the place, then that's a really good way of getting that place to stick in your mind, because you remember what it looks like and you remember how it feels. So the problem with a lot of modern architecture is symmetry. Modern architects like symmetrical, many of them like symmetrical buildings, and symmetry can be very pleasing on the eye, but it's it's not good for helping us distinguish one place from another and giving us a sense of where we are so much, because things look the same, and the brain likes things to look different for the purposes of navigation. It's good to have things that are that don't look similar, and that's something that I think modern architects haven't really grasped. That things that look nice are not necessarily going to make people feel comfortable. But it would be a great subject to look at whether the ancients were better at.
Yeah, and the reason I've asked this because you studied the behavior psychology of people, and as it is known, the symbols, they have a bigger impact unconsciously to people. I mean, and there are a lot of buildings. Actually, in Odessa, there are a lot of buildings that are survived. I mean, that have survived from. I mean, they were built maybe in 17th and 18th centuries, and there are many of them around the world as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether this is relevant to the interview, but when you talk about symbolism, it can be visual symbols, but also it can be mental symbols. So, and included in that would be an idea of the history of a building and what had happened there and who had lived there, and this kind of information helps you build up a picture that distinguishes that particular building from another. So you don't just need visual information to help you with a landmark. Cultural, historical information can also be really helpful because it sort of sets it in the brain.
Yeah, definitely. I interviewed Charles Landry, and he actually believes that city's history plays a huge role in deciding whether the city is going to do well or not. So when we see city as a classroom, what do you think a city can teach us? I mean, in general, any city.
I think it can. There are many things. I think it teaches how our surroundings, our environments affect our mind, because cities that have a lot of green space in, for example, feel very different to cities that are full of concrete. And there's plenty of studies showing how mental ill health is more common in places where there is less green space. So I think it's fairly well accepted that the urban environment or any environment has a profound effect on how we feel, on our emotions, and on our stress levels. Cities that are very noisy, people that it affects. Obviously, it's a stressful thing trying to live in a noisy city. But if you ask someone whether the noise affects them, often they will say, "Oh, it's fine. I'm coping with it." But if you measure their heart rate and their breathing and skin conductivity and other physiological measures of stress, it'll show that it's having a profound effect. So people tend to compensate. It seems that people compensate for a stressful urban environment in other ways. There's other studies that show how if you walk down a street that's full of very uniform buildings and there's no variety, that affects people's mood differently to, say, if you're walking down a street and there are more shops, more different things on the street, different things to break up the uniformity. So all those things seem to affect the way people feel, their emotional balance, and also their mental health. So I think that's one way that cities can teach us about how our environment has an effect on our minds.
Well, thank you so much for the interview, Michael.
Thank you. Great questions.